And the two oldest ones both joined the Navy. They were lost 9 days apart. So the parents lost two oldest sons within 9 days of each other. How do you get over that?
You're listening to the Stories Behind the Stars podcast. My name is Tatiana Fallon, and I'm your host. This podcast is run by the organization Stories Behind the Stars. This has nothing to do with Hollywood. We are telling the stories behind the stars that were given in World War II. For those of you who are not familiar, during World War II, when a service member was killed, the family received a banner with a gold star on it. We are telling the stories behind these stars. Our goal is to put them all 400,000 into a common database, which then we will build a smartphone app that will be searchable from any location where you can read the story behind the star and you can really come to know the individual that died on D-Day and fought for our freedoms. This podcast is dedicated to telling those stories as we find them, as our researchers are doing this amazing research. You'll hear from researchers who are all volunteers from all across the country, and you'll hear their story, what brought them to the project, and then also the stories that they're finding. This is amazing content, and I really hope you enjoy this adventure.
Thank you for listening to the podcast today. We have the opportunity to have Steve Booth with us. Steve, will you take a second and introduce yourself?
Well, I think you did a fine job there. As you said, my name is Steve Booth. I am a retired pharmacy technician, except I went back to work. I had the opportunity to join with our local county health department, and so I am giving COVID-19 vaccination shots, trying to get this pandemic out of here.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's what I'm doing. I was... in my spare time, I saw the or actually it was the newspaper article for Stories Behind the Stars about a year and a half ago in the Salt Lake Tribune, and that spoke to me. And the reason that it did is because my uncle served in the 743rd Tank Battalion during World War II. He survived, luckily. But I was the sole caretaker for he and my aunt in their later years. And I finally got him to start talking to me about what he had experienced during his time in Europe. When he was 86 years old, he told me that he would like to learn how to use a computer because my father was pretty good on a computer. So I bought him a computer, went over and set it up, got him online, and he started taking classes at the Salt Lake Community College in operating a computer. Now, this is when he was 86 years old. By the time he was 90, he was pretty proficient. And he was online, he was chatting with his 743rd buddies or their survivors. I finally asked him to sit down and write out his memories on the computer for me. I've got a really good story, and I found out he was a creative, wonderful writer. But he gave me a real shot about what was going on. At the end of World War II, the 743rd became a occupational government in Germany, in Berlin. And during the time they were there, one of the members of the 743rd found a linotype machine, and they printed up a book that was the combat story of the 743rd. It was a day-by-day account of what they went through, and it also has listed all of the members of the 743rd, all of the KIAs, and all of the MIAs. And so I have all the names that I want. And so I told your dad that I was adopting the 743rd as my project. So now I've stretched out and I helped out with D-Day, and I'm also helping out with Pearl Harbor.
That's amazing. That's so cool. So he, so did he tell you personal stories, or he just wrote it all out and gave the whole thing to you, or?
A little bit of both. In the beginning, it was verbal back and forth, and when I talked him into sitting down and writing it out, he started from the day he enlisted in 1943 through everything, all the way through. One of the things I discovered in writing the stories for the fallen people in the 743rd is he kind of gave me the sanitized version of what was going on. And right at the end of what he wrote up, he said, "This is about all I can remember," parenthesis, or really wish to remember. And I think a lot of the World War II veterans are the same way. They just don't want to remember it. They don't want to relive it.
I get that, though, that you see things you don't want to see. And I mean, when I interviewed, there's a man in our neighborhood, and I was teaching a World War II class. And so he served in the engineer corps in Europe. And I was like trying to find a veteran for my students to interview. So I called him up and I said, "Hey, would you be willing to do this and be willing to talk to these kids in my class?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll do that." Yeah. He was 94 at the time.
Yep.
And so his daughter helped us do it, because, we were going to meet on Zoom, and this was back in 2017. And I asked him questions, and he answered questions that she had never heard before. Yeah. Like stories that she told me later. She's like, "Thank you so much for reaching out and asking him these questions." Yeah. Because I heard things that I didn't even know. And maybe because I'm not a family member, or maybe because I was in a teaching experience, he was willing to reach out. But I mean, I asked him, did you find the Holocaust camps? And he's like, "Yeah, we walked up to him and it looked like gravel, but it wasn't gravel. It was teeth." And yeah. And he said, his daughter was just like, "I had no idea what my dad had been living with that memory his whole life." Yep. So it's just, I think for their own sanity, it's just I don't want to go that far down remembering those things. It's amazing that
my uncle was also involved in liberating some of the the camps, the prisoner camps over in Germany, and his unit actually, when they were towards the end of the war, they were moving towards Berlin, and one of the officers of the tank command ran into a couple of Finnish soldiers that had been working with the Nazis, and then Finland cut all ties with Hitler. And so the Nazis just grabbed these Finnish soldiers and put them in the concentration camps also. And then, because the GIs or the Allies were moving towards them, getting close to Bergen-Belsen, they packed about 3,000 people on an old cattle car train and proceeded to move forward to take them deeper into Germany for extermination. The tank corps caught up to them. And so the guards on the train, on the siding, abandoned the train and took off. The tankers got a few of them and brought them back, but a lot of them just disappeared into the countryside. But when the two tanks that were investigating this actually found the train on the siding, they found 2,500 people that were packed in those rail cars that were scheduled to be exterminated, and the tank corps liberated them. They got them out of, and there's some pictures that are really interesting, taken by Major Clarence Benjamin and Sergeant George Gross, that shows these people as they realized the Americans had arrived and they were going to be saved. They're just The pictures are absolutely outstanding. You can find them, if you want to look at them, you can find them on a website called A Train Near Magdeburg, Magdeburg.
So your uncle was there when that happened, or?
No, he not at Magdeburg.
Okay, but that was still this unit.
Yeah, that was another company of their tank battalion, but he was involved in liberating 2 or 3 other concentration camps that they did come across.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. So, do you have any particular stories that you've uncovered that you'd like to share with our audience?
I do. About 3 years ago, I think it was, I belonged to a credit union here in Utah, and the CEO sent out a bi-monthly newsletter with the monthly statements. And just before Memorial Day, probably 4 years ago, part of his newsletter was about his uncle, who had served with the 743rd Tank Battalion and was lost on D-Day. And so I contacted the manager in my area and I said, can you get a message to John? And he said, yeah, what's up? And I said, his uncle served with my uncle in the 743rd. I didn't know there was anybody else from Utah that was there. But I said, I've got some information, the combat story of the 743rd and a bunch of other stuff that he might be interested in seeing. And so I met him. He said, can I bring my wife? And I said, yeah, sure. Not a problem. So I met he and his wife for lunch one day, and we sat for probably 3 hours while he went through that book and taking pictures with his cell phone and just talking about what was going on. So when I got together with your dad on this Stories Behind the Stars, his uncle was the first story I published. A young man hit Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, and got into some pretty hairy action. Of course, all of them did, but he was killed on D-Day on the 6th of June and was lost. He was missing in action for about a week before they finally found him and figured out what was going on. And then in 1948, his family made application to repatriate his remains, and he is now buried in the Ogden City Cemetery. But that was my first one, and I realized that when you have relatives and survivors that you can talk to, it just warms the story right up. It's not just the facts. They have insight that is not posted on Ancestry.com or anywhere else.
Yeah. So just real quick, because I'm naive about this, but the Tank Battalion on D-Day, they came in after, right? After the infantry, kind of with the tanks?
No, they were... The 743rd Tank Battalion was created in 1942 specifically to lead the landing on Omaha and Utah Beach in Normandy. So they were the first ones on the ground, and the infantry followed them because they were the armor. And
okay.
So they were the tankers actually acted as cover for the infantry troops that landed.
So was his tank shot? Is that how he perished, or how did I know some of the tanks sank, right? I mean,
yes, a lot of them, but they were the 741st Tank Battalion. They were supposed to be, they called them direct drive, DDs, and they were supposed to float into the water because they had a canvas shroud around them, and they fixed a propeller to the back of the tank that would propel them through the water. The problem they ran into was when the LCTs, the landing craft tanks, dropped their ramps. They were about 600 yards out from the beach. And so these guys were supposed to go splash in the water and then swim up to the beach and then take off. But what happened was D-Day was supposed to have happened on the 5th of June. But because they had a storm and the seas were so rough, Eisenhower decided to cancel it and do it the next day. Well, the next day, the seas weren't as heavy as they were the day before, but they still were. And because these tanks got into this surf that was really heavy waves, that's what swamped them and sank them. And the two commanders that were, the two company commanders that I know of that were on the LCTs and witnessed this, just canceled the orders to the skippers, the LCTs, and said, do not drop them now, take them all the way in. And so that's what they did. And so about 10 of the tanks originally were lost because they sank, and the rest of them, the LCTs took them right in on the beach, and they, of course, then they engaged. But with Lund, the soldier I just told you about, he was knocked out of his tank as he was approaching, or as he was going up Omaha Beach. And so he had to bail out of his tank. And so he found another one where the driver was shot. And so he moved the driver out of the way, hopped into the second tank, and proceeded to move it along. He was knocked out of that, and that's when they got him. And he was further in, so they didn't know where he was.
So how do you get knocked out of a tank? Because
you get hit by artillery.
Oh, okay.
Artillery shell will shut a tank down, or in some cases, they explode because they've got all this ammunition that they're carrying. Yeah, plus the gas tank. They ran on gas. Speaking of that, one of the things I discovered while I was doing some stories is to repatriate remains of soldiers that were killed and buried in various places in Europe. The families had to make application to the Quartermaster General in Washington, D.C. to get permission to do that. And those applications, for the most part, have become public records. And so that helped me write the stories and see what they were doing. And so I can't remember which soldier it was, but I pulled up a record, a repatriation application, and was looking at it. And I'd seen a lot of them before that, but I was looking at it and I saw 5 names. The soldier they wanted to repatriate, and 4 others at the bottom, along with their service numbers. And I started thinking, what the heck is this? And so I took the soldiers' names at the bottom and their service numbers and started doing research on those guys. And I discovered what it was the 5 men that were lost were all in the same tank crew. They were in the same tank. And the tank was hit by an artillery shell and exploded. And so what the Army did was, when they went out to recover them, they got what they could, and all 5 went into the same casket. And so they repatriated 5 that time. I found out that in a case like that, the next of kin don't get to choose where they're buried. The Army does that. Because how do you explain to somebody, I'm sorry, I can't send your son's remains home?
Wow.
Yeah.
And this stuff is just, it adds depth to the war. I mean, I'm not a huge historian of World War II. I've read lots of books, and I've watched, Ken Burns, and I've done things, and obviously involved in this project, so I'm passionate about it. But I love hearing the individual's part in, specifically, what did the tanks do on D-Day? What did the landing craft do on D-Day? What did the Navy do? Every single one of parts. And then then you hear the other end of the story too. It's like, what happened to the families of the soldiers that were in tanks?
Exactly.
That's just adds a depth to history that you just don't see portrayed as much, because maybe it's difficult to say, or I don't know, maybe people don't realize how, as a mother, just knowing, oh, my son's gone. And then I'm like, I can't get him back because of this incident that happened. Like, it's just, you don't think about that when you think about D-Day.
I just finished a Pearl Harbor story about a family of, I think there's like 7 kids, and the 2 oldest ones both joined the Navy. They were lost 9 days apart. So the parents lost 2 oldest sons within 9 days of each other. And I was thinking exactly the same thing you just said. Man, how do you get over that?
Yeah. And so the guy that you told his story, his name was Lund. Was that right? Or
yes, his name was Alvin Winton Lund, but he went by Wint. And when I was researching him, of course, his nephew, I knew his nephew through the credit union, but he had one sister that was still a survivor. And so I managed to get a conversation with her, which again brings a lot of warmth to stories like this. I'll give you another one. This one fascinated me only because it fascinated me by mistake. It was one of those things I lucked into. The soldier's name was Jasper. He went by Jack, middle initial E's, last name was Leonard. So I started doing some research. He was with the 743rd Tank Battalion also. So I started doing some research, and I went to the website Find a Grave. And I was looking at some information there, and right at the bottom, there was a message that was posted by a guy in his hometown who volunteered every Memorial Day and Veterans Day to go out to the local cemetery and put flags on the graves of the veterans or the fallen soldiers. And he mentioned Leonard's name in his message. He would like to know more about him. It was posted, I think it was posted like 11 years before I saw it. And so I don't know why it was still there, but there it was. And so I sent this guy a message through Find a Grave and said, I am researching Jack Leonard's history and participation in World War II. I would like to speak to you. So he sent me an email back really quickly. And he said, his sisters are all gone, but he's got a niece that lives here right next door to me. And so he said, I gave her your email address also. And I said, that's fine. And so I chatted with her a little bit and asked her if she had any, told her what I had and asked her if she had any information that might be interesting to use in the story. And I got back a lot of things, but one of the things that she sent me was a letter. And if you don't mind, I'll tell you what she said. What I wrote in the story is in a poignant tribute to Sergeant Leonard, his niece, Sister Patty Lou's daughter, Jacqueline, and they called her Jack in his honor. Bailey wrote a note to me. It says, I have spent a good part of my evening reading letters that were written by Uncle Jack to my grandparents and my mother while he was in the military. Some of these were written when he was in training, but many came from both England and France. That's when they were engaged. It was fascinating for me to finally read these. I have had them in my personal possession since 1999, when I found them in the highest cabinet in my mother's house that had been destroyed by flooding from Hurricane Floyd. These were so treasured by my mother. She was extremely close, and she had them put in the safest place in her house. I suppose it says a lot about how Jack's siblings loved and respected him when you understand that 3 of them named their children for Jack. I am the only girl to possess that name. All 3 of us have been called Jack all our lives. I hope he would be proud of the tribute. My uncle's letters to my grandparents, this is the good part. My uncle's letters to my grandparents and to my mother I was amazed at how much personality came alive for me. I knew he was very handsome and that he was popular with the women, and handsome part is easily identified by his photos. I've also been told that he was very fun-loving and a tease. This came through clearly in his letters. I'm glad that I finally let myself read these tonight. In his letters, Jack would tease my grandmother about bringing home a girl from England and telling her that he couldn't understand what the girls in France were saying, but he liked them too. In one letter to my grandmother, he even said he was getting old, 30. That maybe he should think about courting a certain person when he returned from France. My grandmother would intervene for him. Oh, if my grandmother would intervene for him. I knew this person as an older later and knew this was a joke because Jack and my grandmother was definitely not his type. He even signed his letter to my grandmother, "Love, Jack, ass." Knowing my grandmother, I never would have dreamed any of her children would ever utter such a thing to her. Obviously, Jack loved teasing her a lot. Anyway, it just shows what, and she sent me, one of the things that happened was Jack was a sergeant. He was a tank commander. And on his first foray into France, his tank was knocked out by 3 German tanks. He got hit by artillery. So not being able to move, he was sitting in one place. So he proceeded to take out the 3 tanks that came after it. And then he had to walk back to his unit. Well, after about a mile or so, he encountered a horse. And having been raised on a farm, he commandeered this horse and rode the horse back to his unit. Fortunately, there was an AP photography in his unit that got a picture of him coming in on the horse. That kind of stuff you can't get anywhere but with family.
Wow. I love that. I love that so you've been doing this research for a long time then.
Yeah.
Just in legacy of your uncle, just continuing these stories, and you were just collecting all this, and were you going to write a book or?
I didn't know. Wow. I just, when he gave me his stuff in writing, I knew there was more out there, and having the book, having the information, having all of that, it just kind of flowed.
Wow. It's so cool to hear family and that you've taken the time to connect with family, and just think about you reaching out and saying, "Hey, tell me more about your uncle." And then she can have, "Oh yeah, my uncle," and have that amazing interaction with him, even though he's been gone for so long. Right. So it's just kind of cool to see how us doing this work is actually healing family, and to some extent,
Yes. With the fact that she'd had those letters for probably 15 years and never looked at them. And then finally, after I contacted her, she took them down, and that's what she found. I mean, that's just very, very satisfying.
Yeah. And I think it's also, I don't know the quite right word is liberating or insightful, but to know that when we do this work to find these stories, they get to live again in the hearts of their family. They get to live again in the hearts of posterity. And so it's so inspiring to hear, their legacy, they keep going, it's not the end. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, listening to these amazing stories of these fallen heroes. If this is content you want to keep hearing, please consider sharing this podcast with others. The more we grow our listening base, the more people we can reach, the more impact we can have, the more volunteers we can find, and the more stories that get told. So if you like this content and you're enjoying what you're hearing, please follow us and share and find us on any social media platform and follow us there.
And then most importantly, check us out at storiesbehindthestars.org. Click the volunteer button and join the Star Corps. Thank you.